Medical assistance in dying. I'm assuming that people basically know what this is, so I'm not really going to go into it a whole lot, but if you don't, then that might be something you want to ask somebody about at some point. Medical assistance in dying, or as we like to call it in Canada, MAID, as an acronym, includes both euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. Those are the more traditional terms, and has been practiced legally in Canada since 2015, 2016. So still relatively recent. Tonight I'm going to try to convince you that MAID is truly an ethically complex subject. In saying this, I'm arguing against any simple approach to the issue, whether for MAID or against it. The ethical reality that MAID involves us in is not simple but complex. And so any simple attempt to resolve the issue is bound to fall short of the reality. So I have my own views on whether, in the end, MAID is ethically acceptable or not. I'm sure many of you have your own views as well on that subject. I'm not planning to present or promote my own views here. Instead, I want to invite you into the moral complexity of the issue. How many people here have seen The Good Place? Show The Good Place. Good number of you. Okay, so in The Good Place, there's this one character called Chitty, and he's a moral philosopher. And one of the sayings that keeps going around in that film is, "That's why everyone hates moral philosophers." Right? And I just happen to be a moral philosopher as well. So I kind of connect with him, but I'm just hoping that tonight, in trying to present the moral complexity of this issue, I'm not going to come across as too much of a Chitty. Chitty in the show, he sometimes goes up to the stand to get some breakfast, and he's trying to choose a muffin, and it's between a blueberry muffin and a carrot muffin, and he basically spends, an hour or two and ends up just going away in despair because it's so complex of a decision to make. I'm also going to try to be brief. So many of the things that I'm going to say are like pointers to topics that we can follow up on further if people want to later on. And after arguing for the complexity of this topic, I will try to situate MAID within the broader context of what it means to die well, and how we can take good care of people who are reaching the end of their lives. So if you end up not liking this talk very much, at least you have free soup and $1 lattes. So something good will come of this evening. All right, so to begin, let me unpack what I mean by calling MAID an ethically complex issue. An issue is ethically complex when there are very compelling ethical reasons that support incompatible approaches to the issue. People who have a strong position on medical assistance in dying often have what I call a basic sort of moral script, a little saying that settles the issue for them. On the pro-MAID side, people say things like, people have a right to die with dignity. Or they say things like what someone said to me recently, when animals get sick, we put them down. Why would we treat humans worse than animals? Or they say things like, we should let people choose to die on their own terms. On the anti-MAID side, people who are against MAID, some of the moral scripts are, we shouldn't have doctors killing their patients. Or if we accept MAID in voluntary cases, we're going to end up having involuntary cases. Or MAID will erode our commitment to provide high-quality end-of-life care. Each of these little quasi-proverbial statements can be and has been unfolded into an extensive argument. And there is at least a kernel of truth in each of them. Noticing that there are kernels of truth on either side of the issue is a sign that the issue is ethically complex. You can't settle the issue by just asserting one of these little scripts. Because if you could, then the issue wouldn't be the issue would be settled, but on both sides. And that would mean that the issue wasn't really settled after all, because it would be settled for different people who take incompatible approaches to the topic. So we need to look deeper than individual reasons or assertions if we want to appreciate the ethical status of this issue. But when we do look deeper and start unpacking the moral scripts into full arguments, the ethical complexity doesn't go away, quite the opposite, it gets worse. Let's take one aspect of the debate. I'm going to focus on one aspect primarily tonight. Made as an act of killing versus made as an act of mercy. People who are against made will often say that made is morally wrong because it involves killing. They are clearly right to raise this point, because killing another person is quite possibly one of the morally worst things that anyone can ever do. And made, at least as commonly practiced in Canada, involves administering an injection to stop the heart of the person receiving made, but to intentionally stop someone's heart is to kill them. And so made looks like it's very seriously wrong. Simple enough, it seems. And indeed, any complete account of the ethical status of made must face the fact that it involves killing. You can't just ignore that. But complexity creeps in at this point in at least two ways. Firstly, many, maybe most of us, don't think that every case of killing is wrong. Killing seems justifiable, for instance, when it's necessary to preserve one's own life from violent attack. So we can't jump right away from made involves killing to made is ethically wrong, because it may be that made is another justifiable form of killing. And proponents of made try to show just that. According to them, there are strong reasons that make made justifiable, at least in certain cases. And these reasons need to be addressed in a complete account of the ethical status of made. Complexity also creeps in when we consider the difference between standard wrongful killings and the killing that takes place in made. When someone is murdered, that's our word for standard wrongful killing, someone's murdered, they almost never want to die. But many people who receive made, who receive it voluntarily, do want to be dead and give clear and explicit consent to be killed. Another difference between made and standard wrongful killings has to do with the reason why it's wrong to kill someone. Killing is wrong, at least in part, because it deprives the victim of many good things that life involves. Relationships, meaningful work, pleasant experiences. There's many things that are good about life. But for the people for whom current made legislation was designed, life often no longer contains many of these goods, while it does contain many evils. Pain, loss of control, a sense of being a burden, etc. Since, unlike standard wrongful killing, made can be received voluntarily and without depriving people of the goods of further life, it seems to be less wrong than standard wrongful killing. It may still be wrong. Indeed, if it's always wrong to take an innocent human life because each such life is sacred and inviolable, then made would still be wrong. We can talk more about that principle, the sanctity of life principle, later on if you want to. But now let me switch over to one of the strongest arguments in favor of made. This argument appeals to mercy and to the ethical obligation to prevent and relieve suffering. Here the idea is that if a person is in intolerable suffering, and the only way to help them overcome that suffering is by ending their life, then helping them end their life may be ethically required. Indeed, this sort of argument is one way of presenting made as a justified form of killing, as is reflected in the language that's sometimes used of mercy killing. Proponents of made are surely right to point to the sometimes excruciating pain and profound emotional, psychological, and existential suffering that people can experience, particularly toward the end of life. This suffering cries out for a response. And if we are people of compassion, we will want to respond in a fitting way. The need to respond to suffering must also be part of any complete account of the ethical status of made. But it would be too simple to say that the fact that made would get rid of suffering makes it the right thing to do. Complexity creeps in here too. For one thing, we would have to show that all suffering needs to be gotten rid of. I would never want to suggest that suffering in general is a good thing. In particular, I wouldn't want to, go up to someone who's in the throes of awful suffering and say, hey, it's probably for a good purpose. But nevertheless, might there be some good purpose for some forms of suffering? Does suffering ever lead to profound growth, deepened relationships, or a greater focus on what's truly important in life? Probably does. But okay, for the sake of argument, let's say that all suffering should be gotten rid of, period, and that offering death is a fitting way to get rid of it. We would still need to ask who should be entrusted with the power to deal out this death. Is it a good idea to have doctors who were traditionally trained to seek only the cure or comfort of their patients, the people who are charged with accompanying us in our darkest and most difficult times, now becoming accustomed to also ending patients' lives? In particular, should doctors be able to take patients' lives as a response to any sort of suffering, or only certain carefully delimited forms? If we allow MAID for only certain forms of suffering, where do we draw the line? And who gets to decide? And as you would know, if you've been following the recent election debates that were going on, this is very much something that Canadian society is wrestling through right now. Where do we draw the line? Do we need to expand this? Do we need to make it easier to access MAID? Complexity undermines the simplicity of the argument from suffering to MAID in another way. For this argument to work, we would need to show that there is no better way of responding to the suffering than offering death. The hospice palliative care movement has worked hard to show that there are ways of managing nearly every sort of physical pain that humans can experience, and that there are also ways of dealing with psychosocial and existential forms of suffering as well. At the extremity of suffering, hospice palliative care can sedate suffering patients into unconsciousness so that the suffering is no longer felt. Balfour Mount, the founder of the modern palliative care movement in Canada, said this: "The suffering of people at the end of life has been enough to legalize euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, but interestingly, not enough to mandate excellence in palliative care for all Canadians. This is an ongoing need, and in my view, a tragedy." That's the end of the quotation. To simply offer death as a way to respond to human anguish is undoubtedly an ethical tragedy, especially if there are other ways that we could have dealt with that suffering. Maybe there are cases that the most skilled palliative care physician and team couldn't manage. These are surely the hardest cases for those who are opposed to MAID to deal with. If there are some cases of suffering that we can't deal with in any other way, does mercy require that we respond to them by offering death? Okay, so far I've focused on two key aspects of the MAID debate, killing and mercy. But other points that seem clear and simple to people at first also dissolve into complexity on more careful examination. On the pro side, don't people have a right to die the way they want to and when they want to? Well, if that entails a positive obligation on the part of others to ensure that the person is dead, then maybe not. Don't we need MAID to help people die with dignity? That's going to depend on what you mean by dignity, and that in itself is a very complex matter if you start looking into it. On the contra side, won't allowing voluntary active euthanasia lead to involuntary and non-voluntary forms among other abuses? Well, it might, but it's hard to say, and it's a complex question that involves a lot of empirical work. Each of these aspects of the issue could be considered in much greater depth. But for now, I'm going to conclude by trying to broaden out the context of the debate a little bit. How does MAID fit in with the idea of a life well lived and of a death well died? For centuries, deathbed rituals included the practices of being reconciled to others, giving and receiving forgiveness, making practical preparations for the care of those you would leave behind, and putting your spiritual house in order. These practices were supported by a literature known as the ars moriendi, or art of dying. Today, we tend to die unprepared, often after a series of visits to the hospital, and after having undergone increasingly painful and debilitating treatments, searching for a cure when cure is no longer realistic. Medical technology has blessed us with longer lives, and I very much believe that. I mean, my dad just went through 2 months of intensive interventions in a hospital and is alive and coming home and doing pretty well now as a result. But medical technology can also curse us with deaths in isolation from community, at war with our dying bodies, and without having attained a spiritual sense of peace. Many people die in hospitals these days, and often it's not a great place to die. Somewhat ironically, given the way that it is opposed to traditional values, MAID can support a sort of contemporary art of dying. Picking a day when the doctor will administer the series of injections culminating in the one that stops your heart can help a person prepare for the end, and family and friends can gather to say goodbye. People sometimes have a favorite meal, a favorite last meal together before their loved one's life is ended by a doctor or nurse practitioner. But it's worth noting that an art of dying can be supported without MAID, and hospice palliative care has advocated for ways to help make the experience of dying as good as it possibly can be for decades prior to the legalization of MAID. MAID has a poignant, practical edge to it given our aging population. As the baby boomer generation moves into old age over the next 2 or 3 decades, we will have a greater proportion of people over the age of 65 than ever before in history. People refer to this as the Silver Tsunami. Projections show that in Canada, we can expect there to be less than 4 people in the workplace for every person over age 65. How are we as a society going to navigate the multifaceted challenge that this will bring? We now have MAID in place, but I'm hopeful that we won't be relying on it as our primary solution for the difficulties of old age. The healthcare system spends vastly more money on people near the end of life than at any other stage of life. Economic pressures can make it seem expedient to put an end to suffering by using MAID. If MAID becomes the expected or normal route for people who reach a certain level of dependency, will people feel pressured to choose it? Will they have to justify not using MAID? Hospice palliative care workers testify that people who ask for MAID often don't really want to be dead. Instead, they are motivated by fears of loss of control and of being a burden on others. Proper care and attention to these issues frequently leads to people changing their minds and being willing to live out the life that remains to the best that they can. So, will we be happy with our societal response to the coming challenges if our elderly feel it to be their duty to end their lives with the help of a doctor in order to avoid burdening their families and society? Is this the sort of system that you yourself would like to be in at the end of your own life? Regardless of what one believes about the ethical acceptability of MAID, I think it should concern all of us deeply how we can honor our elders who have gone ahead of us and worked hard to make life better for us and for our children. How can we build capacity as a society to care well for those reaching the end of their lives? How can we help make the end of life a beautiful and glorious crescendo for those who reach it, rather than a lonely fizzling out surrounded by beeping machines and wires and strangers? That is one of the major challenges we are facing today. And I, for one, am excited about the opportunities for creative ways of doing good that this situation affords us. Instead of turning our heads from the challenges, I say that we should do our best to take them head on. And we can talk about that more later on if anyone wants to as well. That's kind of where a lot of my research is trying to head in that direction. So that's the end of my talk.